Before Europeans brought sugar to North America, Native Americans were creating desserts from maple sap, wild berries, and acorn flour. The Ojibwe made candy from tree sap every spring. The Cherokee boiled dumplings in wild grape juice. The Navajo baked blue corn cookies with juniper ash. These weren't just sweets, they were sacred foods tied to ceremonies and seasons. Then forced relocation, boarding schools, and cultural suppression made these recipes disappear. Here are 30 Native American desserts nobody makes anymore. Wojapi was a sacred dessert of the Lakota people, made by crushing wild chokecherries until they released their deep purple juice. The berries were crushed by hand, seeds and all, then simmered in iron pots until they thickened into something between jam and sauce. No sugar, no thickeners, just berries and slow heat that concentrated the natural sweetness into a deep purple sauce. So tart it made your mouth pucker before turning sweet on the finish. Women gathered the berries in late summer, their hands stained purple for days. At ceremonial feasts, Wojapi was ladled over fresh bread while elders told stories. In 1890, at a gathering in South Dakota, children watched their grandmothers make it the same way their great-grandmothers had taught them. When the government banned traditional ceremonies in the 1900s, the feast stopped. The recipe survived in whispers, passed quietly from grandmother to granddaughter, until the last generation who knew where wild chokecherries grew passed away. Nobody makes it anymore. Chokecherry patties were the original energy bar, carried by Plains warriors on long hunts across the Dakota Territory. The process was simple, but required patience that modern cooking has forgotten. Women pounded fresh chokecherries into a thick paste, seeds crushed so fine they added texture instead of bitterness. The paste was spread thin on flat stones or wooden boards, then left in the summer sun for days until it dried into leathery discs, dark as dried blood, and just as concentrated. Each patty packed enough natural sugar and nutrients to sustain a hunter for hours. They were stored in parfleche bags, stacked between layers of sage to keep insects away. During the winter of 1876, after the Battle of Little Bighorn, Lakota families survived on these patties when buffalo became scarce and the Army burned their food stores. By 1890, reservation life had changed everything. Women no longer had access to wild chokecherry groves. The drying stones were left behind during forced relocations. The knowledge of which trees produced the sweetest fruit died with the generation that had tasted freedom. Wild berry cakes were how Pacific Northwest tribes preserved summer for the brutal coastal winters. Salmon berries, thimbleberries, and wild strawberries were collected in late July when the fog lifted and the sun finally broke through. Women mashed the berries by hand in cedar bowls, working them into a thick pulp that smelled like the forest after rain. The pulp was spread onto cedar boards in rectangular shapes, about half an inch thick. Then the boards were set on drying racks built above slow-burning alder fires. The smoke kept insects away and added a subtle flavor that store-bought fruit leather could never replicate. After 3 days, the cakes could be peeled from the boards and rolled tight, stored in woven baskets lined with skunk cabbage leaves to keep moisture out. Coast Salish families rationed these cakes through winter, cutting small pieces to eat with dried salmon. In 1885, a missionary wrote about watching women make them near Puget Sound. By 1920, the boarding schools had taken the children. Nobody was left to learn which berries to pick or how long to smoke them. Salal berry cakes were black as night and twice as mysterious to anyone who hadn't grown up eating them. The Puyallup and other coastal tribes knew that salal berries, small and dark purple, grew thick in the understory where Douglas firs blocked out the sun. August was harvest time, when families walked trails their ancestors had maintained for centuries. The berries were gathered by hand, crushed into paste, then shaped into flat cakes and dried on western red cedar boards. The cakes turned almost black as they dried, hard enough to last through winter, but soft enough to chew when you needed quick energy. They tasted like concentrated forest, sweet, slightly astringent, with that distinctive salal tang that modern taste buds can't quite place. In the 1880s, these cakes were still being made at villages along the Washington coast. Women sang while they worked, teaching their daughters the songs that went with the harvesting. When the reservations broke up the villages and scattered the families, the drying boards were left behind. The songs stopped. Nobody makes salal berry cakes anymore. Many of you have been asking where to find these recipes. We've gathered hundreds of them from the Depression era through the 1970s in our cookbook, Grandma's Kitchen. Complete instructions, pro tips in 10 chapters. Link is in the description below. Now, let's get back to the video. Huckleberry pudding was the taste of high country summers made by tribes who followed the berries up into the mountains when the snow finally melted. Wild huckleberries grew at elevations where the air was thin and the work was hard. Families would camp for weeks in the same spots their grandparents had used, picking berries that were smaller and more intensely flavored than anything you could buy today. The berries were cooked down with a little water and stone-ground cornmeal, stirred constantly over a low fire until the mixture thickened into a pudding that was deep purple and impossibly rich. Served warm or cold, depending on the season. In 1870, a fur trader in Montana wrote about tasting it at a Salish camp and calling it the best dessert he'd ever eaten. The families who made it are gone now. The high country camps are empty. Forest Service regulations closed off access to many of the traditional picking grounds. The huckleberries still grow up there, turning ripe every August. But nobody climbs up to harvest them the old way anymore. These weren't recipes written in cookbooks. They were knowledge carried in hands that knew exactly when berries were ripe and how long to dry them in the sun. When the children were taken to boarding schools, the hands grew still. The berries still grow wild. Nobody picks them anymore. Serviceberry cakes were called different names depending on where you were. Saskatoon cakes in the north, Juneberry cakes further east, but the process was always the same. The berries ripened in early summer, just after the last frost, when families were still hungry from a long winter. Women gathered them by the bushel, working quickly before the birds stripped the branches bare. The berries were mashed into a pulp, sometimes mixed with a little buffalo fat to help them bind, then pressed into flat cakes and dried in the sun. Each cake was about the size of your palm, dark reddish purple, and sweet enough that children would sneak pieces when their mothers weren't watching. The Blackfeet made them. So did the Cree, the Salish, and a dozen other tribes across the northern plains and mountains. In 1883, a photographer documented Blackfeet women making these cakes at a summer camp in Montana. The photo shows them working side by side, their hands stained dark from the berries. By 1910, most of those women were gone. The recipe went with them. Maple sugar candy was spring's first gift, made by Ojibwe families who tapped trees the same way their ancestors had for 1,000 years. When the days warmed but the nights still froze, the sap started running. Families moved to sugar camps in the woods, living in birch bark lodges while they collected sap in wooden buckets. The sap was boiled down in large kettles over open fires, reduced slowly until it reached the perfect temperature for candy. Then it was poured into wooden molds carved with tribal designs, or simply dropped onto clean snow where it hardened instantly into golden drops. Children got the first pieces, their reward for helping collect sap all day. The candy was pure sweetness, with a complexity that refined sugar never matched. In 1875, an Indian agent in Wisconsin reported that Ojibwe families were still making it the traditional way. By 1920, the sugar camps were mostly abandoned. The government wanted the children in schools, not in the woods learning to tap trees. The molds were lost. The songs that went with the boiling were forgotten. Maple sugar cakes were art pressed into food, made by Iroquois women who turned liquid sweetness into solid tradition. After the sap had been boiled down to syrup, then boiled further until it crystallized, the hot sugar was poured into carved wooden molds. The molds were family heirlooms, some of them centuries old, carved with clan symbols and geometric patterns that meant something to the people who made them. Turtles, bears, eagles, each cake carried a story. When the sugar cooled and hardened, it was turned out onto birch bark and stored in containers made from folded elm bark. These weren't everyday sweets. They were made for ceremonies, for gifts, for sacred occasions when ordinary food wouldn't do. In 1880, a Seneca woman told an ethnographer that her grandmother's molds had been carried on the Trail of Tears and survived when almost everything else was lost. Those molds are in a museum now, behind glass. Nobody uses them to make maple cakes anymore. The sugar camps are silent. The ceremonies changed or stopped entirely. Blue corn cookies tasted like the high desert, made by Navajo families using corn that had been bred blue over centuries of careful selection. The corn was ground fine on stone meddits, the same ones used for making bread and mush, mixed with juniper ash, not for flavor, but for the minerals it added, a tradition that went back so far nobody remembered when it started. A little water, a little animal fat, formed into small rounds and baked on hot flat stones near the fire. They weren't sweet like modern cookies. The sweetness came from the corn itself, a subtle taste that only revealed itself after you'd been eating them for years. The texture was somewhere between a cookie and a cracker, slightly sandy, with that distinctive blue corn flavor that nothing else quite matches. In 1885, these cookies were still being made at Navajo camps across the Southwest. By 1930, most families had been relocated. The grinding stones were too heavy to carry. The juniper ash tradition seemed old-fashioned to children who'd been taught to be ashamed of everything their grandparents knew. Sweet corn pudding was how Iroquois families turned their most sacred crop into dessert, mixing it with maple syrup and wild berries when the harvest was good. Fresh corn was scraped from the cob with clamshells, the milky liquid caught in wooden bowls. Maple syrup was added, along with whatever berries were in season, strawberries in June, blueberries in July, blackberries in August. The mixture was cooked slowly in clay pots, stirred constantly so it wouldn't burn, until it thickened into something between pudding and porridge. Served warm, usually at harvest celebrations or Thanksgiving ceremonies when the three sisters, corn, beans, and squash, were honored for another year of abundance. The pudding was sweet but not cloying, the corn's natural starch giving it body without needing anything else. In 1890, Haudenosaunee families were still making it at harvest time. By 1920, most of the ceremonial cycle had been disrupted. Christian missionaries convinced many families to abandon the old Thanksgiving ceremonies. The clay pots broke and weren't replaced. The recipe faded into memory, then vanished entirely. Every dessert tied to a season. Maple candy in spring, berry cakes in summer, corn pudding at harvest. The calendar wasn't written down. It was tasted, passed from grandmother to granddaughter in mouthfuls of sweetness. When the ceremonies stopped, the seasons lost their meaning. The desserts disappeared with them. Atole was the warm embrace of winter mornings in Pueblo villages, made from blue corn that had been nixtamalized with wood ash and ground into fine flour. The process of making nixtamal was ancient, older than anyone could remember, turning ordinary corn into something the body could actually digest and use. The flour was whisked into water or milk, stirred constantly over a low fire until it thickened into a drink that was somewhere between hot chocolate and thin porridge. Some families added cinnamon bark when they could get it. Others sweetened it with piloncillo or wild honey. But the traditional way was just corn, water, and patience. The drink was served at dawn before the men went to work in the fields and the women started grinding more corn for the day's bread. It filled your stomach and kept you warm when the high desert mornings were cold enough to see your breath. In 1880, every Pueblo family made atole every single morning. The smell of it cooking was how you knew a household was awake and functioning. By 1930, commodity flour from the government had replaced most traditional corn grinding. Coffee became the morning drink. The medates used for grinding corn sat unused in corners. The younger generation didn't learn to make atole because their parents were trying to assimilate, trying to survive in a world that punished them for being too Indian. The recipes weren't written down. They just stopped being made. Nobody wakes up to the smell of atole anymore. Indian pudding was born from collision, created when English colonists tried to make their traditional hasty pudding with cornmeal instead of wheat, because wheat wouldn't grow in New England soil. But the Wampanoag and other coastal tribes had been making similar dishes for centuries before any colonists arrived, cooking cornmeal with maple syrup and berries into thick porridge that sustained them through brutal winters. The colonial version added molasses and milk and eggs, turning it into something that could be baked instead of just boiled. By the 1800s, it had become a distinctly American dessert, served at Thanksgiving tables and harvest celebrations across New England. The irony is that most people forgot it started with Native American corn and Native American cooking techniques. In 1850, it was still being served at taverns and homes from Maine to Connecticut. The texture was dense and custardy, the flavor a combination of corn, molasses, and spices that tasted like autumn itself, served warm with cream poured over the top. But by 1920, it had started disappearing from tables. Too old-fashioned, too plain compared to the elaborate desserts that were becoming fashionable. By 1950, you could only find it at a handful of traditional New England restaurants. Today, it's almost completely forgotten, this dessert that was once as common as apple pie. The Native American corn dishes that inspired it vanished even earlier, erased so thoroughly that most people don't even know they existed. Grape dumplings carried the memory of home for Cherokee families who were forced west on the Trail of Tears. Families would gather them in late summer, crushing them to make juice that was so tart it made your face pucker. The dumplings were simple: flour, water, a little fat worked into a dough, rolled thin and cut into strips or small squares, dropped into the simmering grape juice, and cooked until they puffed up and turned purple from the liquid. The result was something between a fruit soup and a cobbler, sweet and tart at the same time, with tender dumplings that soaked up the grape flavor. By 1920, most families had stopped making it. The younger generation didn't know where to find wild grapes. Store-bought juice didn't taste right. The recipe survived in a few families, passed down quietly, but most people forgot it had ever existed. Wild plum cakes were how Plains tribes captured the brief, intense sweetness of wild plums that ripened for only 2 weeks in late summer. The plums were pitted by hand, tedious work that left your fingers stained dark purple, then mashed into a thick pulp. The pulp was spread onto flat surfaces and dried in the sun until it formed leathery sheets that could be rolled up and stored. Each cake tasted intensely of plum, concentrated and slightly tannic, with a sweetness that hit you after the initial tartness faded. They were eaten as snacks during winter, cut into small pieces and chewed slowly. The knowledge of which ravines had the best plums died with the grandmothers who used to walk those places. The plums still grow wild across the plains. Nobody gathers them to make cakes anymore. Elderberry fritters were made by Cherokee families when the elderberry clusters hung heavy in July, their dark purple berries releasing a wine-sweet smell that attracted bees and birds. Women stripped the berries from their stems, discarding any that were green or damaged. The berries were mixed into a batter made from cornmeal, a little water, and sometimes an egg if the chickens were laying well. The batter was dropped by spoonfuls into hot bear grease or later, after contact with Europeans, into lard. The fritters puffed up as they fried, turning golden brown on the outside while the berries inside burst and released their juice. Eaten hot, they were crispy outside and jammy inside, sweet enough that children would hang around the cooking fire, hoping for seconds. By 1920, most of the elderberry stands had been cleared for farmland or development. The grandmothers who knew exactly where to find the best bushes were gone. The ingredients still exist. Wild grapes grow along fence lines. Elderberries ripen every July. Blue corn can still be ground on stone. But knowing when to harvest, how to prepare, which prayers to say, that knowledge died with the grandmothers. The desserts died with the ceremonies that gave them meaning. Berry slump was what New England tribes called their version of fruit cobbler, made centuries before English settlers arrived and tried to claim it as their own invention. The berries were small and intensely flavored, nothing like the fat-cultivated varieties sold today. They were simmered in clay pots with a little water and maple sugar until they broke down into a thick, bubbling sauce. Then came the dumplings, cornmeal mixed with water into a thick batter, dropped by spoonfuls onto the simmering berries. A lid went on the pot to trap the steam. The dumplings cooked in the berry vapor, puffing up and absorbing the fruit flavor while staying tender inside. After about 20 minutes, you had something magical: sweet tart berries underneath, fluffy purple-stained dumplings on top. Served warm, often with more maple syrup drizzled over. Today, people think of it as colonial New England food. Nobody remembers it was Native American first. Acorn cakes were the staple dessert of California tribes, made from acorns that were processed through a method so complex it took years to master. Acorns were gathered in autumn, dried, shelled, and ground into flour on stone mortars that had been used by generations of the same family. Some families leached it in sand pits near streams. Others built special frames lined with pine needles. The process could take days. Once leached, the flour was mixed with water into a dough, sweetened with berries or honey if available, then formed into flat cakes and baked on hot stones. The cakes had a subtle, nutty flavor that's impossible to describe if you've never tasted them. Slightly sweet, earthy, with a texture like dense pound cake. The oak trees still stand. Nobody processes acorns anymore. Sunflower seed cakes were created by Mohawk families who cultivated massive sunflower fields generations before Europeans arrived in North America. The seeds were harvested in late summer, dried, then roasted in clay pots to bring out their nutty flavor. The roasted seeds were ground on stone methods into a coarse meal that smelled like toasted nuts and sunshine. This meal was mixed with maple syrup and a little water, then formed into small cakes and dried in the sun or near the fire. Each cake was about the size of your palm, dark brown, and intensely flavored. By 1920, nobody was making sunflower seed cakes anymore. The recipe survived in written form in a few anthropology journals, but the living knowledge, the feel of the dough, the smell when it was right, that was gone forever. Peon nut brittle was made by Pueblo peoples who knew exactly which years the peon trees would produce heavy crops and which years they'd find nothing but empty cones. The nuts were incredibly rich, oily, with a flavor like pine and butter combined. To make brittle, the nuts were mixed with honey or later, after Spanish contact, with piloncillo sugar that was heated until it turned amber. The hot mixture was poured onto flat stones and left to cool into sheets that could be broken into pieces. Each bite was intensely flavored, the sweetness of the sugar balanced by the resinous pine taste of the nuts. Today you can buy peon nuts at specialty stores. Nobody makes the traditional brittle anymore. Black walnut treats were made by eastern woodland tribes who knew the secret to taming one of North America's most intensely flavored nuts. Black walnuts aren't like English walnuts. The shells are so hard they can break nutcrackers, and the flavor is so strong it can overwhelm a dish if you're not careful. The nut meats were picked out painstakingly, then ground into a paste with stone tools. This paste was mixed with maple syrup and sometimes dried berries, then formed into small balls or patties and stored for winter. The flavor was unlike anything else, bold, almost tannic, with a distinctive bitter edge that balanced the sweetness perfectly. The knowledge of how to process black walnuts properly, how to balance their bitter flavor, what to mix them with, all of that disappeared. Black walnut trees still grow wild. Nobody processes them the old way anymore. These weren't just desserts. They were connections to specific places. This oak grove, that elderberry stand, these walnut trees along the creek. When families were relocated, those connections broke. The recipes required knowledge tied to land they could no longer access. The desserts couldn't survive the displacement. Saguaro fruit syrup was sacred to the Tohono O'odham people, made from the crimson fruit that ripened at the top of giant saguaro cacti in the brutal heat of the Sonoran Desert summer. The harvest was a ceremony as much as a task, marking the beginning of the new year in the traditional calendar. Families traveled to ancestral gathering sites where their grandparents and great-grandparents had harvested before them. The fruit grew 30 feet high on the arms of the saguaro, accessible only with long poles made from dried saguaro ribs lashed together. Young men would knock the fruit down while women and children gathered them in baskets, working quickly before the midday heat became unbearable. The fruit itself looked like a red fig split open, filled with thousands of tiny black seeds suspended in crimson pulp. The pulp was scraped out and boiled down in large clay pots over open fires, stirred constantly as it reduced to a thick syrup that was dark as blood and twice as sweet. This wasn't just dessert, it was the basis for a ceremonial wine used in rain, bringing rituals. The syrup was also mixed with water to make a refreshing drink, or eaten straight as a treat. Children would sneak spoonfuls when their mothers weren't watching, their mouths staining red. In 1880, the saguaro harvest was still the most important event of the Tohono O'odham year. Families gathered for weeks, camping near the cacti, sharing food and stories while the syrup cooked. By 1920, everything had changed. The reservation system had disrupted traditional migration patterns. Many families couldn't travel to ancestral harvesting sites anymore. Christian missionaries discouraged the rain ceremonies, calling them pagan rituals that needed to be abandoned. The younger generation grew up in government schools where they were punished for speaking their language and taught that their traditions were primitive. The knowledge of exactly when the fruit was ripe, which saguaros produced the best fruit, how long to cook the syrup, what songs to sing while harvesting, all of that began to fade. By 1950, only a handful of families still made the syrup the traditional way. Today, some Tohono O'odham families have revived the practice. But it's a conscious act of cultural preservation, not the unbroken tradition it once was. Prickly pear candy was how Southwest tribes turned one of the desert's most abundant resources into portable sweetness that could last for months without spoiling. The prickly pear cactus produces bright magenta fruit in late summer, covered in tiny hair-like spines that are nearly invisible but incredibly painful if they get in your skin. Harvesting required knowledge and technique. Women used wooden tongs or thick leather pads to twist the fruit off the cactus, then rolled them in sand to remove the spines before processing. The fruit was split open to reveal flesh that ranged from deep red to pale yellow, depending on the variety. The flesh and seeds were scooped out and crushed, then cooked down in clay pots until they reduced to a thick, intensely colored syrup. This syrup was poured onto flat stones or wooden boards and left in the desert sun to dry into sheets. As it dried, the syrup transformed into something like fruit leather, but thicker and more concentrated. It could be cut into squares and stored, or rolled up and carried as trail food. The flavor was unlike anything else, sweet and slightly floral, with a subtle tartness that kept it from being cloying. Apache and Tohono O'odham families made this candy every year, timing the harvest to coincide with the fruit's peak ripeness. Mesquite bean cakes sustained Apache and Pima families through desert summers when other food sources dried up and disappeared. The mesquite tree was one of the desert's greatest gifts, producing long seed pods that hung in clusters from the branches in late summer. When the pods turned yellow-brown and started to split, that was the signal to begin harvesting. Families would spread blankets under the trees and shake the branches, collecting the fallen pods before rodents and livestock could get to them. The pods were fibrous and tough. filled with hard seeds surrounded by a layer of sweet pulp. The traditional way to process them was to pound them in wooden mortars using stone pestles, hours of work that turned the pods into a coarse meal. This meal could be mixed with water to make a sweet drink, or formed into cakes and dried. The cakes were dense and chewy, with a flavor that was sweet but also savory, almost coffee-like, with hints of cinnamon and caramel. They were incredibly nutritious, packed with protein and natural sugars that provided long-lasting energy. In 1850, mesquite bean cakes were still a staple food across the Southwest. Apache families made them every summer, storing them for winter when food became scarce. The cakes could last for months without spoiling if kept dry. By 1880, everything was changing. The Apache Wars had scattered families across the region. Many were confined to reservations where mesquite trees didn't grow as abundantly. The children were being sent to boarding schools where they learned to eat bread and commodity foods instead of traditional meals. Akutak was the original ice cream of Alaska's native peoples, made from ingredients that sound impossible to modern ears but were perfectly logical for people living in the Arctic. The name comes from the Yupik word meaning mix them together, which is exactly what you did. Whipped animal fat with berries, sometimes fish, sometimes meat, creating a dessert that was simultaneously sweet, savory, rich, and absolutely essential for survival in one of the world's harshest environments. The traditional method started with rendered fat, usually from seal, caribou, or moose. The fat was whipped by hand in wooden bowls, beaten with wooden paddles, or by hand until it turned white and fluffy like modern whipped cream. This took strength and patience, sometimes an hour or more of constant beating. While the fat was being whipped, someone else would be preparing the additions. Wild berries were the most common. Salmon berries, cloudberries, blueberries, crowberries, whatever was available. Sometimes dried fish was shredded and added, sometimes chunks of caribou or moose meat. Sugar wasn't traditional, but after contact with Europeans, some families started adding it. The texture was incredible, light and fluffy from the whipped fat, studded with berries that burst on your tongue, with an underlying richness that modern ice cream can't touch. This wasn't a treat in the modern sense. It was survival food, packed with the calories and nutrients needed to endure Arctic winters. But it was also celebration food, made for feasts and special occasions. In 1880, every Alaska Native family knew how to make akutak. Wild rice pudding was how Ojibwe and other Great Lakes tribes transformed their most sacred grain into something that tasted like the lakes themselves, earthy, nutty, with a subtle sweetness that revealed itself slowly. Wild rice wasn't actually rice at all, but the seed of an aquatic grass that grew in shallow lakes and slow-moving rivers across the northern United States and Canada. Harvesting it was a ceremony, done in late summer from canoes, using wooden flails to knock the ripe seeds into the boat while leaving enough behind for next year's crop. The rice was then dried and parched over fires, a process that gave it its distinctive smoky flavor and made it possible to remove the hulls by treading on it with moccasins or pounding it in wooden mortars. To make pudding, the rice was cooked slowly in water until it softened and split open, revealing the pale interior. Maple syrup was added, along with whatever berries were in season. The mixture was cooked down until it thickened, creating something that was part porridge, part pudding, with the wild rice adding a texture unlike any grain you can buy in stores today. The flavor was complex. The nuttiness of the rice, the sweetness of the maple, the tartness of the berries, all combining into something that tasted like the northern forest condensed into a bowl. This pudding was served at harvest celebrations, at winter gatherings, at any time when families wanted to honor the gift of wild rice. In 1850, Ojibwe families were still harvesting wild rice the traditional way and making this pudding for ceremonies and everyday meals. The rice beds were managed carefully, protected, passed down through families as inheritances more valuable than money. In 1900, everything was changing. Dams altered water levels and destroyed many rice beds. Mining and logging polluted the waters. White settlers claimed lake shores where Ojibwe families had harvested for generations. Children were sent to government schools and weren't there for the harvest. They didn't learn to recognize when the rice was ripe, how to knock it into the canoe without damaging next year's crop, how to parch it properly. These weren't convenience foods. They required weeks of preparation, specialized knowledge, access to wild places. When families were confined to reservations, when children were taken to boarding schools, when wild harvesting became regulated or forbidden, the desserts couldn't survive. The recipes needed freedom. They needed land. They needed time. Sweet bean cakes were created by the Oneida and other Haudenosaunee nations who understood that beans weren't just savory food, but could be transformed into something sweet and sustaining. The beans used were typically white beans or kidney beans, grown in the same fields as corn and squash, according to the Three Sisters planting system that had sustained Iroquois people for centuries. The beans were harvested in late summer, dried thoroughly, then stored for use throughout the year. To make the cakes, dried beans were soaked overnight until they softened and plumped up. They were then boiled until completely tender, soft enough to mash easily. The cooked beans were mashed by hand in wooden bowls until they formed a smooth paste. To this paste was added maple syrup for sweetness, and often dried berries, blueberries, strawberries, or blackberries, depending on what had been preserved from summer harvest. Sometimes nuts were added too. Black walnuts or hickory nuts crushed and mixed in for texture and richness. The mixture was formed into small cakes about the size of your palm and then dried. Some families dried them in the sun on wooden racks. Others dried them near fires during colder months. As they dried, the cakes became firm and portable, perfect for carrying on hunting trips or long journeys. They would keep for months if stored properly in bark containers or leather pouches. The flavor was unusual to anyone who hadn't grown up eating them. The beans provided an earthy base that was neither sweet nor savory, but somehow both. The maple syrup added sweetness without overwhelming the other flavors, and the berries provided bursts of tartness. In 1750, these cakes were common food across Iroquois territory, made by women who had learned the technique from their mothers and grandmothers. The recipe wasn't written down because it didn't need to be. You learned by watching, by helping, by eventually making your own batch under supervision until you got it right. Squash custard was an Abenaki innovation, transforming winter squash into a dessert that tasted like autumn sunshine preserved in a bowl. The squash varieties used weren't the ones you find in modern supermarkets. These were heirloom varieties with names like Hubbard and Butternut, cultivated for generations to be sweet and dense flesh. Squash were harvested in early autumn before the first frost, then stored in root cellars or cool, dry places where they would last for months. To make custard, a squash was cut open and the seeds removed. The flesh was either baked until soft or boiled in clay pots, then mashed smooth with wooden paddles. The mashed squash was mixed with maple syrup for sweetness, and eggs if they were available, though the traditional version predated chickens and used other binding agents like pounded nuts or thick cornmeal. Wild ginger was sometimes added for a spicy warmth. Hickory nuts were ground and mixed in for richness and texture. The mixture was cooked slowly, stirred constantly until it thickened into something between pudding and custard. Served warm or cold, it was smooth and sweet, with the earthy flavor of squash coming through beneath the maple sweetness. The texture was silky, almost like modern pumpkin pie filling, but looser, more spoonable than sliceable. This wasn't everyday food. It was made for celebrations, for harvest festivals, times when the year's bounty was being honored and shared. In 1800, Abenaki families in Vermont and New Hampshire were still making this custard using traditional methods. The squash came from gardens their families had tended for generations. The maple syrup was made at sugar camps in their own woods. The wild ginger was harvested from forest floors they knew intimately. Everything was local. Everything was known. By 1850, the Abenaki people had been pushed to the margins of their territory. Much of their land had been taken for white settlement. The sugar camps were on land they no longer controlled. The gardens were smaller or gone entirely. Children were being pressured to assimilate, to abandon traditional ways and become civilized. The language was being lost, and with it went the traditional knowledge that had been passed down orally for centuries. By 1900, few families were still making squash custard. Fruit pemmican was the original energy bar, created by Plains tribes who needed portable, calorie-dense food that wouldn't spoil during months-long buffalo hunts or winter journeys across frozen prairie. Traditional pemmican was made with dried meat and rendered fat, but fruit pemmican added berries to create something that was part nutrition, part medicine, and part dessert. The process started with meat, usually buffalo or deer, that was cut into thin strips and dried in the sun or over smoke until it was completely desiccated, hard as wood. This jerky was then pounded into powder using stone tools, worked and reworked until it was as fine as sawdust. At the same time, fat was being rendered from the animal's bones and marrow, melted down until it was liquid and clear. Berries, choke cherries, Saskatoon berries, blueberries were dried until they were wrinkled and concentrated. Some families pounded the dried berries into powder. Others left them whole. The powdered meat, rendered fat, and berries were mixed together in specific proportions that had been perfected over generations. The hot fat was poured over the meat powder and berries, then everything was mixed thoroughly and packed into rawhide bags called parfleches. As it cooled, the fat solidified, binding everything together into a solid mass that could be cut into pieces and eaten. The flavor was intense, the richness of the fat, the savory umami of the meat, the sweetness and tartness of the berries, all hitting your palate at once. It was dense enough that a piece the size of your fist could sustain you for a day. In 1850, every Plains family knew how to make pemmican. It was essential technology, as important as knowing how to make fire or track animals. The fruit versions were especially valued because they provided nutrients that prevented scurvy during long winters when fresh food wasn't available. By 1880, the buffalo were nearly extinct, killed off systematically to force Plains peoples onto reservations. Without buffalo, traditional pemmican became impossible to make. Some families tried making it with beef. Reservation beef was lean commodity meat, nothing like the rich, fatty buffalo meat that had made proper pemmican possible. The berries were still available, but without access to traditional hunting territories, families couldn't gather them in the quantities needed. Children were being sent to boarding schools where they were fed white people's food and taught that their traditional diet was primitive. In 1850, every Plains family knew how to make pemmican. It was essential technology, as important as knowing how to make fire or track animals. The fruit versions were especially valued because they provided nutrients that prevented scurvy during long winters when fresh food wasn't available. By 1880, the buffalo were nearly extinct, killed off systematically to force Plains peoples onto reservations. Without buffalo, traditional pemmican became impossible to make. Some families tried making it with beef, but reservation beef was lean commodity meat, nothing like the rich fatty buffalo meat that had made proper pemmican possible. The berries were still available, but without access to traditional hunting territories, families couldn't gather them in the quantities needed. Children were being sent to boarding schools where they were fed white people's food and taught that their traditional diet was primitive. By 1920, almost nobody was making traditional pemmican anymore. The knowledge of exactly how to render the fat, what ratio of meat to fat to berries, how to pack it so it would last, all of that was fading. Today, you can buy pemmican bars at health food stores, but they're made with modern ingredients and modern methods. The traditional version, made with hand-pounded buffalo meat and wild berries, is gone. Alcan was more than dessert. It was a sacred food made for Colonial-era, the 4-day ceremony celebrating a Navajo girl's transition to womanhood. The cake itself was massive, sometimes 3 feet across, made in an earthen pit that had been specifically for this purpose. The preparation began days before the ceremony, with family members collecting the ingredients and preparing the cooking site. The cake batter was made from white or yellow cornmeal ground on stone metates, mixed with water and sometimes a little sugar or honey. The ingredients belied the complexity of the process. A pit was dug in the ground with corn husks that had been soaked until they were pliable. The batter was poured in, more corn husks layered on top, then the whole thing was covered with earth. A fire was built directly on top and kept burning all night while the cake cooked slowly in the retained heat of the earth. The girl undergoing the ceremony was involved in the preparation, learning the techniques from her mother and grandmothers. She would grind some of the corn herself, pour some of the batter, help tend the fire. The cake was as much about the process as the product, a way of teaching her the skills and knowledge she would need as an adult woman. After cooking all night, the cake was unearthed in the morning. The smell as the earth was cleared away was incredible. Sweet corn, smoke, earth, all combined into something primal and nourishing. The cake itself was dense and slightly sweet, with a texture unlike any modern baked good. The edges were firmer where they'd been in direct contact with the hot earth. The center was softer, almost creamy. It was cut into pieces and shared with everyone who attended the ceremony, sometimes hundreds of people. In 1880, Colonial-era was still being performed regularly across Navajo territory, and with it, Alcan was being made. The ceremony was central to Navajo culture, a way of passing knowledge and values from one generation to the next. By 1920, the boarding schools were working hard to stamp out traditional ceremonies. Navajo children were taken from their families and forbidden to speak their language or practice their religion. Many ceremonies, including Colonial-era, went underground or stopped entirely. Without the ceremony, there was no reason to make Alcan. The knowledge of the earth needed to be, how long to cook the cake, all of that required hands-on experience that wasn't being transmitted anymore. Today, some Navajo families have revived Colonial-era and with it, Alcan. But for several generations, the knowledge was broken. The elders who knew how to make it properly died without teaching enough people. What exists now is a reconstruction, pieced together from memories and written descriptions. It's not quite the same as the unbroken tradition that existed before the boarding schools tried to erase it. Cedar berry paste was made by Pacific Northwest Coast peoples, particularly the Puyallup and other Salish tribes, from the small red berries that grew on western red cedar trees. Most people don't even know cedar trees produce edible berries, but Coast Salish peoples had been harvesting them for thousands of years. The berries appeared in late spring, tiny and rust-colored, growing in clusters at the tips of cedar branches. They weren't actually berries in the botanical sense, but small, woody cones, and they weren't sweet like most berries. Instead, they had a resinous, slightly astringent flavor that was unlike anything else in the traditional diet. Harvesting them required knowledge and timing. You had to know exactly when they were at their peak, which lasted only a couple of weeks. Women would collect them carefully, picking only from trees that had been used by their families for generations. The berries were crushed in wooden bowls or stone mortars worked into a paste. Sometimes they were mixed with other ingredients to balance their strong flavor: salmon oil, dried berries, rendered fat. The paste was incredibly thick, almost sticky, and it was stored in bentwood boxes or woven cedar bark containers. It was used both as food and as medicine. A small amount eaten before meals was said to aid digestion. Mixed with water, it became a drink that helped with respiratory ailments. As a food, it was eaten in small amounts, often spread on dried salmon or mixed with other foods. The flavor was intense, woodsy, slightly bitter, with that distinctive cedar taste that's impossible to describe if you've never experienced it. In 1850, coastal families were still making cedar berry paste using methods that hadn't changed in centuries. The knowledge of which trees to harvest from, how to process the berries, what to mix them with, all of that was common knowledge among Coast Salish peoples. By 1900, everything had changed. The boarding schools had taken the children. Traditional territories had been carved up and privatized. The cedar forests were being logged extensively for their valuable wood, and the old growth trees that produced the best berries were being cut down. The practice of making cedar berry paste began to fade. It was labor-intensive, the flavor was too strong for palates that were becoming accustomed to white people's food, and there were easier ways to get food. By 1930, almost nobody was making it anymore. The few elders who remembered how told anthropologists about it, but their descriptions went into academic journals that their own grandchildren never read. Today, most people walking through a western red cedar forest have no idea the berries are even there, much less that they were once harvested and processed into a paste that was both food and medicine. The knowledge is gone, surviving only in fragmentary written descriptions that can't convey the living tradition of how it was actually made and used. 30 desserts. Erased by boarding schools, stolen by forced relocations. The government thought they'd kill these recipes forever. They were wrong. Right now, native families are digging up recipes, replanting ancestral seeds, teaching children what was supposed to die. This isn't history. This is resistance, happening right now. So smash that like button if this opened your eyes. Hit subscribe if you want to see what else they tried to erase. Share this with someone who needs to know. They tried to kill the memory. We're the ones who decide if it comes back. Choose.